we've been talking as we go through the chapter about different activities which bring us onto the boundary of breaking Shabbat. Not that break is Shabbat explicitly, really, but we've been circling around the boundaries that the rabbis put on us. And really, we've been focusing on activities which people are under pressure to do because of a mitzvah. We're now going to enter the second chapter. We're talking about lights. It's a very famous chapter because we read it on Erev Shabbat. And we are going to see that the same issues about how close or how far away we can get to breaking Shabbat, how far or how close the rabbis will let us go, runs right the way through the chapter, as do other kinds of conflicts of values, by the way. And just as an introduction to the chapter of lighting the light, I wanted just to bring you, we're going to look at the first Mishnah in a sec, but I just wanted to bring you a comment from the Bartanura on this first Mishnah. And he sets the scene, really, which I wanted us to have in our mind as we read through the Mishnah. The anan kaimalan dener shel Shabbat chova. We hold that the Shabbat candle is obligatory. It's not possible to start Shabbat without a candle. And, they're all it's to do with peace in the house. It's to do with joy. It's to do with the fact that, a meal shouldn't, a meal of a mitzvah shouldn't happen, without light. There are many reasons why the Shabbat candle is obligatory, but because the Shabbat candle is obligatory, how we create it and what sort of danger we get into as we create it is of great interest to the rabbis. So we're going to start. So what are we going to light with and what are we not going to light with? And we're now going to have a list of possible wicks. We got cedar fiber, in this translation, cedar fiber, uncarded flax, raw silk, willow strands, desert wicks, seaweed. These are all different kinds of wicks. And the Gemara goes into great detail to try and figure out exactly what these substances are. And after the list of wicks, we actually have a list of fuels. So we've got Zephet and Shavar and Shemen Kik and Shemen Sreifah and Aliyah and Chelev. We've got pitch wax, castor oil. Shemen Sreifah, we've touched upon in the chapter of Trumot, actually. Shemen Sreifah is Truma oil, which has become tameh. That's a problem. And we know that's a problem, right? Because if it's tameh, we can't give it to the Kohen, but we can't do anything else with it. So what are we going to do with it? Well, we're going to burn it. Shemen Sreifah is Truma oil, which has become tameh, and we're going to burn it. And usually it's just referred to as Shemen Sreifah. That's how we're going to refer it onwards. And then Te'el Fatul Chelev. And Nachum Hamadi, Nachum the Mead says that you can kindle with Chelev as long as it's melted. And the sages say whether melted or not, they may not kindle with it. The Gemara is going to explain this Mishnah in terms of practicality, and in particular in terms of how close it might bring us to wanting to break Shabbat. And the Rabbah said we're jumping into the Babylonian, the Talmud Bavli now, the Babylonian Talmud. Until now, we've mainly looked at the Yerushalmi, actually, but now we're in the Bavli. And he explains, look, we've had a list of wicks and we've had a list of oils. That's in our Mishnah. That's the structure of the Mishnah, the wicks and the oils. And Rabbah said the wicks are given because the fire flickers on them. It sputters and it doesn't burn well. And the oils operate in the same way. They're not drawn effectively by the wick. And the rabbis are worried that we've got a light. We have an ancient light, a light at the time of the Mishnah, essentially a crockery implement full of oil, and it's got a wick hanging into it. We light the wick and the wick will draw the oil out of the crockery implement. It's hanging over. And the rabbis are anxious that we're going to somehow, if it's not drawing well, we're going to tip the oil and start a real fire. And we know from all of our discussions on cooking and on fire on Shabbat in the first chapter that we can't create a real fire on Shabbat. We can carry on a fire which is already lit. But just as we're not going to stoke the coals to improve the heat on our roast, remember that's the end of the last chapter of the Mishnah. We don't put ourselves into a situation where someone might be tempted to stoke the coals in order to get a better roast for his Shabbat evening dinner. We don't want to put ourselves in a situation where we might be tempted to tip this wooden vessel in order to get more oil into the wick. And then we might start a real fire. And then, or we might stoke up the fire, and then we really have broken Shabbat. So we're trying to keep, we need light. The light is a mitzvah. But having that light brings us very close to breaking Shabbat, and we need to keep away from that. And that's the reason behind this particular choice of oils and wicks. It's analogous in some way to how we behave with food going onto the roast as Shabbat comes in. Now, the Mishnah then goes on to say, Ein madlikin b'shemen sreifa b'yom tov. We don't light with shemen sreifa on festivals. And we saw at the end of the previous Mishnah 1, shemen sreifa is one of the lists of things that we don't kindle with. We don't kindle with pitch, wax, castor oil, shemen sreifa. And there is a view in the Gemara, by the way, that this halacha that applies to ordinary Shabbatot is actually applied because sometimes an ordinary Erev Shabbat, which is really when we're going to light our light, okay? We're going to light on Erev Shabbat. We're not lighting on Shabbat. Sometimes the Erev Shabbat falls on a festival. And we have a pasuk. It's a pasuk related to offerings. Lo toteru mimenu ad boker. We don't leave the offerings we don't leave anything left over until morning. And vehanotar mimenu ad boker ba'esh tisrofu. And if any of it's left the next morning, we burn it. And this is the next morning after the festival. The idea is that we burn leftover sacrifices the day after the festival, but we don't burn them on the festival itself. And along the same lines, we don't burn shemen sreifa on a festival itself. And the second Mishnah, Ein madlikin b'shemen sreifa b'yom tov, is a reference to not burning. We're not going to burn holy things on Yom Tov. And that probably explains why, or at least according to the Gemara, that explains why generally we don't use shemen sreifa for oil for lighting on Shabbat, because Erev Shabbat may be a festival. And then Rabbi Ishmael is going to carry on with some more kinds of fuels, tar, because it smells bad. It's not honorable to the Shabbat. And it's not honorable to the Shabbat to light with tar, something that smells disgusting. The sages permit with all kinds of oils, and there's a whole list of oils which are permitted. And then Rabbi Tarfon comes in at the end, and he says, no. Rabbi Tarfon comes in at the end. He says, no, ein madlikin ela b'shemen zayit bilvad. You have to use olive oil, just as we tried to on Hanukkah, by the way, because we know that olive oil is the best kind of oil. And the Gemara, the halacha, by the way, does not go according to Rabbi Tarfon. But the Gemara strikes back in a way which is incredibly powerful and perhaps gives us some relevance. It's perhaps relevant to the way we judge halacha today. And the Gemara says, look, Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri stood up and to argue against Rabbi Tarfon. Rabbi Tarfon is a purist, by the way. He saw the Beit Mikdash. He quite often follows Beit Shammai. We learned that Rabbi Tarfon sometimes follows Beit Shammai according to his, and gets into trouble by doing so. Rabbi Tarfon's an extremist. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri stands up and says, no, we can't go like this. What about people in Babylonia who don't have olive oil? They only have sesame oil. Or people in Media who have nut oil. Or people in Alexandria who have radish oil. Or in Cappadocia who have not only naft. Rather, he said, Eila, ein lecha, eila mash amru chachamim ein madlikin. You can only prohibit the things that the sages have said you have to prohibit. In other words, if the sages have said, Ein madlikin, we don't light with them, you can prohibit them. But you can't run around prohibiting other things just because you think olive oil is a better oil. There's a restriction on how many restrictions you can place on the people of Israel. It's not fair to the people of Israel to put more restrictions on them. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri is saying, look, if the sages have said we can't do something, we can't do it, but you can't add to that. The third Mishnah then deals with technical issues to do with Tuma and Tara, and it jumps off just a simple statement. The only thing you can light with that comes from a tree is flax. But then the Mishnah goes on to draw a comparison, and we've seen this before, by the way, in the Mishnah Bikurim, that the Mishnah likes to draw comparisons between one type of halacha and another. And we're now going to draw comparisons between what we can light with and what can become tameh. And we know that if somebody dies in a tent, not only and you can check this, if you look in the Parsha of Chukat, at the sprinkling with the ashes of the red heifer, you'll see that when someone dies, not only things that the dead corpse has touched or people that the corpse has touched, but also the tent that has been touched. The tent that the corpse is lying in are sprinkled with the ashes of the red heifer in order to make them tahor again. And the Mishnah is going to say, just as you don't lie with anything from the tree except flax, anything that comes from a tree, anything that you make a tent out of that comes from a tree can't become tameh except flax. Flax, if you like, it's too close to clothing, basically. And along the same lines, a wick made of cloth. Remember, they used to make wicks out of cloth in those days. They used to take old cloth and twist it. Now, a cloth, of course, is a piece of clothing which can contract tumah. What's its status if we turn it into a wick? Well, it's sort of halfway one and halfway to the other. Rabbi Eliezer says it's tameh. In other words, it can become tameh. It's still a piece of clothing. And he says you can't lie with it. Rabbi Akiva says it's tahor. It's become a wick, not a piece of clothing. And he also says you can lie with it.